Anyways, Brian, welcome to this organization, and I hope that you can have some kind words for all of us on what's happening with salmon.
I wasn't aware I had to limit it to kind words. David didn't. How come I do? Well, thanks, Dave. I think, like Rick, I can agree with almost all of your comments, and I appreciate the summary. Ken, I think you asked a critical question, because the other element of the distribution of these fish is you're talking about major ocean current differences here, south to north, right? So the fish in the Columbia, the fish in Oregon and California, they're in the California current. And of course, then we have the big mixing zone, and then we have our more northerly areas. And so the really, really fascinating question to us, and the challenge is, these are following very general trends. And the other thing is, there was a recent paper that is, I think, a really important point, and Dave showed you this, but the coherence of the variation across all of these populations has narrowed enormously. There's very little difference geographically now. So there is a large-scale effect. And that's why I sort of disagree with the final conclusion you presented, in the sense that, yes, maybe the way we are spending money now and with the new opportunities will be not fully cost-effective, but I don't really see many options other than maintaining as many smolts as we can while something adapts. Let's be honest, if we change today under climate warming, you're not going to see an effect for 25, 30, 40 years. All right? So we have a long-term problem that selective fishing may be a way that we really have to implement. So I think, in a strange kind of way, we've come around to the two topics intersect perfectly. So now, to be honest, I was kind of confused why I was asked to come and talk, and they said related to PSF, and I'm thinking, well, we don't do a lot of this stuff. We put money into some of this stuff. Don't you quote me on all this now, okay? So I've decided to do a couple things. I'm going to comment on some of the work that's been done in the past that I was responsible for before I left the department. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about PSF at the end, because we are going through a transition, right? The big marine survival program that we funded in the Salish Sea is now terminating. We are in the write-up phase. And so now the directorship is looking at, well, where do we go from here? So I'll give you a bit of insight to that. I think the timing of this discussion is perfect. It's been driven here because of a number of problems, but it is the proper topic to take on. And let's be honest, we've been here before. I mean, Dave, how many selective fishing programs have we had? I think 3 in our careers alone, right? So why, right? Why can't we get this moving and continually develop it through time? And I think one of the things you got to keep in mind is that there's the science, there's the biology, but social cultural change is not easy, right? So this takes a big focused program. And maybe the money that's coming through the federal and provincial governments is an opportunity to really demonstrate that what we can do. So keep that in mind. One of the things that I've discovered in my archives as I'm cleaning out is I actually have the designs for the Souk trap, which operated for the Canadian Fishing Company and BC Fisheries, and it operated off Souk. It was a very large commercial catch, and they got rid of it because it was too effective. It caught so many fish on the sockeye and pink returns that they couldn't process them. But we had that through the 50s. So maybe it's time to pull out those old designs and look at strategically located ocean traps. I know we're talking about in river traps, and Carl English and I have tried several times to make these things work for research, not for fishing. And it's not that easy. All right, so I look forward to your discussion on how you're developing that over time. Why do I think it's the right time? Well, we heard about the steelhead. This is an ongoing issue. We know that there is a bycatch problem with the steelhead in the Fraser River. Under the new Salmon Treaty, you are going to hear more and more and more about catch and release. I'm not a big proponent of catch and release. I have personally resisted Massmarket selective fishing for Chinook salmon. I'll tell you that right up front, but it's now here. It will be funded under the new treaty, and Massmarket selective fishing for Chinook salmon in Canada is about to arrive, right? So it's a way to sustain fisheries. It's not proven as a really highly successful conservation tool, and it makes assessment difficult, almost impossible. All right, so I'll come back to that later on. So that's coming. I think one of the things that we are increasingly dealing with is the accuracy of our release mortalities or our incidental mortalities we include in our assessment models, in the coastwide Chinook model, and that we used to do a lot of research on release mortalities. We have not done any work on release mortalities for a number of years, and things have changed. If the water is warming, I would expect that the susceptibility of caught and released Chinook will be different, right? And all species, not just Chinook. And I think the other thing that is increasingly on our minds is that there are interactions with other beasts. There are predator interactions when you do catch and release. I'm sure all you recreational fishermen at one point in time have had a salmon taken off your hook by a seal or a sea lion if you're up north. But it is now becoming so widespread, it's even affecting some of our test fisheries. So there's a population size now that will affect the values that we have developed in the past about release mortality rates. These release mortality rates that we have, based on largely through the 80s, I would say, are used directly in the coastwide model to look at management of ocean fisheries under the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So these are important values, right? The difference between a release rate of 15% and a release rate of 25% doesn't sound like a lot, but it does when you apply it coastwide to a particular type of fishing. So these are really important points that we now have to give some more attention to. The other element of this is that as you get down to fewer and fewer fish, of course the debate about who gets to catch them and how much go to escapement and so on, it's getting tougher and tougher. And so people are continuously asking additional questions about the accuracy and precision and the interaction with temperature and so on. And then you get to the point that David was bringing up, we honestly don't know, right? We have estimates, we have good, probably sort of first estimates of how you should account for this in fisheries these days, but you don't have really strong data if you were really pushed to support this. So let me give you just a little bit of almost a history on what we have done here. And I only do this because we may have to go back and do some of this again, right? So in the 1980s, when I came out here, the very first thing we ever did was the Northern Tagging Program. And Carl designed a live box net that we tried to apply in the skeet and the nass. Our intention was not for fishing. Our intention was to get fish in good quality that we could then put tags on as part of the big Northern Tagging Program. It was tough. I wouldn't say that it was all that successful. We didn't do it again. All right? It's not easy in those pretty natural rivers to really find places that we could get fish in good condition in box trap nets in big rivers. All right? So it's not easy to do it, but we have tried. Probably the biggest coastwide program I ever ran is that we monitor our big commercial troll fisheries in the 1980s. Now, they were big. I mean, we're talking 500,000 plus to 750,000 plus catch. But we had a large logbook program that allowed us to get the size distribution of the catch. We could look at the number of releases associated with the catch, and we did large tagging programs to look at the incidental mortality. What would the release mortality rate be on those fish? But the problem with the release mortality is, how do you structure a coast-wide recovery program to look for external tags? It's simply not easy. You could actually apply different type of tags now and put antenna recoveries in a number of rivers where you might get a better estimate. There are technologies now that we could probably do a better job, but there's no plan in any of the ongoing activities I'm aware of to actually take on those programs. One of the really funny incidences and a big, big discussion with the state of Alaska was when they did the tagging program in the ocean troll, they had 4 categories of the catch, the hook, wound, and one of them was killed. But for some reason, their scientists felt that what you had to do to make sure it was killed is that you had to tag those fish and release it anyhow. All right, so you had 3 categories of severity of wound, one being essentially no obvious wound, and one was that it was already dead, and we threw it over anyhow. So guess, right, I'm sure you're all gonna get it. Where did you get most of the recoveries? Dead, right? That's how tough it is to measure this stuff. And so they were a little embarrassed, but on the other side of the coin, full power to them. You would never have seen that if you had just said that's a dead fish and counted it as dead, right? So these are not easy things to actually take on. One of the things that I spent a lot more time than a lot of other activities was when I first came out in the 80s, the huge criticism on the commercial fishing was the seine catch. I was told stories of hundreds of thousands of juvenile Chinook butchered in the Central Coast every year and so on. And we said, well, it seems impossible. To actually handle that many fish is almost impossible when you look at it. So we bought a fleet of rigid hull boats, and we went out in the Seine fishery, and we actually measured the catch independently of the official records. We boarded the boats, we did all the accounting for this sort of thing. And so we actually estimated the commercial catch independently, so we were able to actually evaluate whether or not we were getting accurate reporting from the Seine fishery. We did the very first acoustic tagging of Chinook released from seines, and we found some fascinating things. When they come up in a seine can be quite deep, but every Chinook that we tagged went deep and sat there for up to 24 hours, and then they resumed migration. But they all had the same performance, and the mortality was really occurring a day to after they recovered and started moving. And then we spent a great deal of time looking at bunt designs. So if you're familiar with a seine net, we're talking about a wider mesh at the beginning so that you can basically strain some of the small fish to get out of the net, and then you close up the seine to catch your fish of target. We found huge differences in that, but the biggest difference of all was not the net, it was the behavior of the fishermen. So if you did not let your bunt fish, if you did not let it sit slack for the 10 or 15 minutes, then you always had higher bycatch, right? So some of these things are just really about the behavior of people and how they handle fish. I'm completely sure that this is also true of recreational fishers and of the troll fishers, how carefully you handle the fish and how you release them. And that, so the fish wheel program that Carl and I ran in the late 2000s, so we actually own the largest aluminum fish wheel built in Canada, and it's sitting at Massmarket. In 2019, it will go back into the river, so we can actually look at selective harvest of pink salmon and release of other activities. And Carl has received money to do that program again. And I guess the big one coming at us is that the Pacific Salmon Treaty has been signed now. We have agreed on 6 out of 7 chapters. All the monies from the government are proceeding. And so in 2019, we will start rearing and mass marking Chinook salmon in Canada. And we will start introducing mass-marked selective fishing in Canada. This will cause a need for a redesign of catch sampling and of just people on the water for enforcement. This will be very difficult to do. And that's going to cost you a lot of money for us to do this as taxpayers. But it was the only way that US and Canada could agree to sustain many of the fisheries in southern BC and Washington State. And that they're already doing mass marking of coho and Chinook in the United States. Canada has done coho, Canada has never done Chinook. So this is a fundamental change that is coming this year. If you want to actually look at the background to this, mass-marked selective fishing generated a huge debate in the commission in the mid-2000s. And there's actually what they call an expert panel report that if you are an insomniac, you should get a copy of and read, because it's 300 pages long, and it is sort of the Bible of quarter-wire tagging and what mass marking means to the assessment. I think the biggest disappointment for many of us that did that analysis is that in the United States now, where you think you could look at the effectiveness of mass-marked selective fishing for coho salmon, where you've got a single age class, you can measure the effect in the fisheries and in the escapement, we cannot definitively show a conservation merit to coho mass-marked selective fishing, right? So that's a single age class, right, to do that. Now, when you say that in the commission, they get a very heated reply from people in Puget Sound, because it sustains fishing, no question about it. There are still substantial fisheries going on, but the presumption of that is that the release of these fish is sufficient to maintain the escapements, and that's not easy to demonstrate, right? So there's another volume at the PSC called Lessons Learned from Massmarket Selective Fishing. And it's actually not a very convincing assessment. So it's going to be a big challenge for us to implement this program. And if there's any message at all, it's you cannot underestimate the amount of uncertainty in terms of assessment and evaluating this as a management tool. This will be implemented. We will go through a lot of angst and learning how to design sampling programs. I remain very uncertain that this is really going to be a big benefit to get the escapements back that David was referring to that we need. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up on the PSF right now. Pacific Salmon Foundation, we do have some guests. So this is a federal charity, and one of the things that we have had the benefit of for many, many years is there is a stamp in Canada that any recreational fisher in the tidal waters that wants to retain a Pacific salmon must buy a stamp. So we get that money back, 100% of it back to the Pacific Salmon Foundation to work with communities to do a lot of the things that David was talking about. We're always working to restore habitats. We're looking at stream cleanups, reprofiling of these streams to provide cool resting pools and so on, a wide variety of activities. We've extended out into the estuaries now and do a lot of estuary restoration. And then the other thing that we've done recently is expanded really into large science programs. So the Salish Marine Survival Program, this was a study of what limits Chinook, coho, and steelhead in the Puget Sound Strait of Georgia. This was privately funded, $23 million of private monies raised by 2 foundations. And so it is now coming to an end. This was the biggest undertaking for a small charity we ever undertook. And so the question now really is, well, where do we want to go with this? So one of the things you will hear from the foundation, and it is a period of transition for us, is our directors have agreed that we will have what they're calling a legacy program at this time. So we will continue to fund probably the tune of $1 million a year for continued research into Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia, like David was saying. We really have to get into the marine environment and really start to study what's going on if we're ever going to really understand the concern that David laid out nicely for you today. There are a number of directors who also want to expand our science program, and so they will be putting more money into what they're calling strategic programs, a really broader application of science. Could well be that it would be into evaluating selective fisheries to see whether or not it really works. One of the things that really has to be tackled in Canada is looking at our salmon enhancement program. It is the largest single government-funded program on the West Coast, and other than quarter wire tagging, we do little to no assessment, right? We, as David pointed out, from all the quarter wire tagging, we know the survivals are poor. And in the Salish Sea program, we did some direct comparisons between hatchery fish and wild fish in the same rivers, and the hatchery fish survive at half or less of the wild fish. So we have to know why. This, to me, is one of the really critical things that the department has not followed up on enough. We also have a continuing program looking at pathogens in wild fish, hatchery fish, and aquaculture reared fish. We are going to continue that program, right? So this is a long-term commitment where that will be ongoing as well. And this year, there's a new program starting with UBC and Dr. Andrew Treitz looking at what is the harvest rate of orcas, the southern resident orcas, on Chinook salmon. And we're going to do this by using acoustic tagging. David is going to be involved with us. There's a group, 7 or 8 scientists involved, right, David? In that one. So it's a big undertaking, and it's really trying to address, if we're down to allocating the last Chinook, how are we actually going to make that decision? Right now, we'd have to make some very bold assumptions. So what we're trying to do is quantitatively determine what is the harvest rate by orcas on Chinook salmon in the environment that we have now. All right, so it's a 3-year program. It was announced a week ago Friday, so it's $1 million to UBC to tackle a really important problem. All right, so that's going to be another one. The other thing that we're taking on is, and we've sort of touched on this. Now, where I differed with David on the conclusion here is, and Ken asked the appropriate question, there may be production zones in the ocean. We know that's true. The difficulty is, what do we do about any of this? And if we think it's associated to climate change, it's clearly long-term. The difficulty here is that it may not be cost-effective, but what else could we possibly do but sustain the seabird migration of various smolts, improve the habitats? Here's a startling number that I just heard from the province of BC last Friday. And they've done an assessment of culverts in BC. 41% of the interior salmon habitats for BC are presently cut off by culverts. That's a provincial number, 41%, right? So just providing access by improving the state of these culverts or passage through these culverts, that could be a huge response, right? Well, it's sort of like David's comment about the smolts again, but here we're not using hatcheries, we're providing access to proper habitat, right? Now, many of these are disrupted habitat by logging, right? The reality is we have very serious problems with pine beetle and with the fires, massive areas. The amount of money that we're looking at, $700 million next year for forest restoration in the fire zones. That's just going to touch the ground. We don't even have enough trees in plantations to touch that yet. So there are big programs that are going to have to be taken on for us to get around this. The other part that the Salmon Foundation is going to do is a series of forum. We've done this before a couple of times, but don't regularly. We're going out to the regions in British Columbia to talk to people about how should we use all this money that's coming our way. For people that aren't aware of some of this, there's an announcement Friday that will be $100 million over 5 years from the federal government. It will be matched by a large sum, not defined yet, from the province of BC. It will be jointly managed, but it's a massive opportunity for funding that we have never seen on this coast, right? So should we just continue to do things in small steps the way we have, or should we think bigger? And my vote is that we think bigger, and we have to really nail down what we need to know, follow from maybe David's comments, and how are we going to go about doing this, because everybody wants some of this pie, right? And everybody's not going to get it if you think bigger and do other things. So these are serious times with fabulous opportunity. And so we really are going to actually go out and start talking to other groups about how do we make these decisions? Who should be involved? How do we have a really intelligent discussion about this? And your time is short. It's an election year, surprise, surprise. So the federal government is going to have the first $20 million out the door in April. There'll be a call. They'll probably give us a couple of weeks to get organized and then start making decisions. So there is zero time to waste, right? So that's why I think a meeting like this is ideally timed to do it. Before I take questions, I just want to say the biggest transition is that I'm leaving, and that this will be the last time I speak as CEO of the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and that I am staying on half-time as a science advisor and do the writing of the Salish Sea, and that. So, but we really need to stay together, and we have a wonderful team at PSF, and if you have not seen the announcement yesterday, I think they really, well, a fine choice. Now, so the person coming in that's going to take away my salary is Jason Huang, who is an expert in habitat restoration in DFO, and he will start full-time April 1st at PSF. And that, so I think with all the funds coming and the opportunities we have, he's the ideal choice. He leads habitat restoration in DFO, and I really look forward to working with him. So thank you for the opportunity, well-timed discussion, and there's going to be lots more to come. Thank you. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Rick? I think he wants you to use the mic here. Yes.
So we can get on.
Okay, thanks. Could you explain exactly what, I mean, I get the words, but I'm not exactly sure how it works. Marking, selective fishing, and what the major problem with it is.
Yeah. We have an hour? Massmarket selective fishing is the coated wire tagging program has always clipped the adipose fin and applied the tag to the snout of the fish. All right. A number of years ago, the federal hatcheries in the United States, to sustain local fisheries and to provide increased returns to natural populations, they decided to clip all fish in federal hatcheries. So these are Chinook, coho, and steelhead. So the mass mark is no longer a designation of a quota wire tag. It's a mass mark of a hatchery-produced fish from a federal hatchery. Canada got on side and would do it for coho salmon. And the reason for doing it for coho gets to the reason of why it's a problem. In coho salmon, it has a single agent return. And right, so you can catch it, you can measure it, and you get the return to a hatchery or the natural population. That's not the case for Chinook salmon. So the confounding problem with Chinook salmon is that you really can't use the quota wire tag models that we do use coast-wide, because some fish are immature. If they're harvested, others are going to stay out immature. And so you confound the fishing mortality with the natural mortality, right? And you cannot separate that unless you use a design that we call the double index tagging. And what this does is doubles the tagging costs coast-wide. And so what we do in our hatcheries now is if you're going to Chinook, you will have a tag code associated with the mass marked fish, and you're going to reverse it. You're going to tag unclipped fish from the hatchery. All right? And so now the unmarked, the unclipped Chinook with a quota wire tag is your measure of the harvest rate on wild fish. But I can assure you that it took months of gruesome discussions to come to that. That is the only option that we can come up with. And that. Now, that was 2005. We, this year, did an assessment of all the programs using mass mark clipping for Chinook salmon in the States and how many are using DIT. 10%. So with the extra costs and basically devaluing the information about natural populations, they're not following the only guideline that we could give them. That'll be the argument in Canada. Right now, we have put in for funds under the treaty to implement and to properly assess. But we'll see. It remains to be seen whether we get the funds. Does that make sense? Okay. Good, you got time for coffee. Oh, sorry. Uh-oh.
Thanks, Brian. I was going to ask this of David, but hopefully both of you might be able to answer. Where around the world are we getting it right when it comes to fish management?
It's a matter of what you consider to be right, I think. Well, I mean, let's start with the problem of poor marine survival. When we started the Salmon Treaty, for example, in '85, we were fishing coho salmon in Canada at 85%. Pretty much all southern BC fish at that rate. You go to Chinook salmon, we were fishing them at 75 to 80%. So the first treaty we were able to actually accomplish, reduce that by 25%. And then if you had to go further, then the country of origin had to take more reductions to meet the escapement targets. Right? So that's the first step. We went further in the second, and we've gone further in the third. Right? So those are the right steps to take. The difficulty, as what we're seeing on David's presentation, is that the declines are far greater than we anticipate, and they keep going on and on and on. So with a 10-year program in the treaty, for example, you just have to constantly be monitoring and adjusting and reducing. Now you've got to the point where productivity is so low that there may not be a sustainable harvest. Right? And that's David's warning that if you use a Beverton Holt and you get over the tipping point, you're going to have to respond very quickly. And responding where you have to collect data over years is a big problem. All right? So I don't say that we're doing things incorrectly. I think what David is pointing out is we're constantly learning. This is why we have a vessel out in the lovely North Pacific right now. Right? They're currently enjoying 5 to 6 meter rollers with waves on top, so they're not having fun today. Right? Coho, we found 3 coho out in the middle of the Pacific, 2 from the Taku River and 1 from a southern U.S. hatchery. Right? They're all over the place right there. So we're learning all the time. We are not putting enough into salmon assessment. So we're not keeping up with the declines. Right? But I don't say in any way that we're not doing things correctly in a sense, but it's a constant learning as you go process right now. David, want to add?
I want to add something. You know, this is not just a Pacific salmon problem. The North Atlantic has exactly the same problem. NASSCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, thought they were being very smart about 25 years ago, and they bought out the commercial salmon fishing
Faroe Islands.
The Faroe Islands that were intercepting their fish, and that was going to fix the problem, and it didn't make any difference. Then they focused on the Greenland fisheries, and the reality is that the marine survival drops that we're seeing in the North Atlantic and for many species in the Pacific are far larger than we can manage in the way that Brian's just suggested. So, these are, it's a bit like the comment about George Bush was warned about sending American troops into Iraq, that it's a very blunt instrument. The same thing can be said for government, that it's got a massive inertia. Once it gets started, it's very hard to change the direction. We have this problem of continuing massive declines in survival. My concern over the last 25, 30 years was, well, the first 20 years of my career was in government. As I said, it's already happening and it's getting worse, and people really wanted to hear that it was probably going to get better, and this is inside the agencies. This is a personal attitude. It's not some people see it as, particularly people in DFO see me as criticizing them as individuals, but the reality is everybody wants to think that they're doing the right thing, and that if they do even more of what they're already doing, that will fix the problem. We've gone from 10% marine survival for Chinook in the early stages of the hatcheries. It's 0.5% now. Put that in perspective. That's 1/20th of the survival that it was. So it's not a drop from 10% to 0.5%, a 9.5% drop. It's a 20-fold drop. It's to 1/20th of what it was. And yet people are saying, well, we have to carry on. This is the best way we can. The people that are doing these programs are not in the best place to be objective about what they're doing. First, they're embedded in a system that will see any modifications as a threat, because that's just the way, agencies work. But more broadly, these problems are going to get worse, and if we just do this sort of knee-jerk reaction of, well, we'll do even more, as I mentioned before, we're losing the opportunity cost is we're losing the opportunity to say, hey, we should be actually changing our strategy, or maybe it's not possible to fix these things. In the short term, selective fishing, absolutely, that's the way to reduce the bycatch that's going on in some of these fisheries. But that's a surgical effort to save the patient today. The patient may die in 2 weeks from infection unless we take some strategies that we may not be doing right now, and that's the reason for my decision to give the last half of that talk, rather than just talk more generally about the survival declines, is to say, we as a group need to be looking much more broadly at these problems and not just say, pour more money into what we're already doing. Some of the things that we're doing is effective. Some of it may actually be counterproductive. But it's not just a BC problem. It's not just a West Coast problem. The same thing's happening in the Atlantic, and the good news is I don't think they're being any more successful than we are, so we could potentially lead the way with doing a better job.
Maybe if I just add one final point on that, Finn, is the other thing, if we're doing something wrong, I think it may be that we talk about ecosystem-based management, but we don't do it, right? I mean, let's be honest. The biggest thing that comes into my office right now is removing the herring fishery in the Strait of Georgia, right? It's a very reasonable thing to do. And if you really wanted to determine whether or not that's having an effect, you could close that tomorrow. You could pay them not to fish. It would not, we have all the money we need to do that. But you need to be bolder and do big things to really separate these factors, right? So, and the other part is that to go to sea and to really tackle what David's saying is that we're not there. We don't have the money right now. We don't have a vessel, for Christ's sakes, right? I mean, it's almost an embarrassment. But it's coming. It'll be here in September, we're told, and that. But one thing we cannot do, so we're in the North Pacific right now with a Russian vessel and that, and the Salmon Foundation had to pay half the cost. We had to bail it out in order to make it go, right? That's just not right. A charity, $500,000 to make this work, right? Why is that not something the government sees as a totally appropriate thing to do? Now, it's not appropriate to directed to the Canadian federal government or to the provincial government, because you did pay, all right? The United States of America, zero, right? Japan, zero. These are the people pumping out the fish, all right? So NPAFC needs a shakeup. And if they really want to tackle these big questions in the ocean, it's not going to be done by one group. So, got time for Carl?
Yeah, just actually more attempt to try and answer your question rather than ask you a question, if I could. Just, I think we can look around where things are done right is where we're managing wild stocks right. A lot of the problems associated with salmon and steelhead are related to enhancement activities where it's all for good intentions to go out and produce more fish. People like to see fish being put in the water, but we're trying to substitute that for the wild production. And you can look into Alaska, and people will say, "Oh yeah, well Alaska's a different part of the ecosystem. They're doing so much better." Bristol Bay had one of the best returns last year of sockeye in history. I have people I work with in Alaska quite a bit. The one thing you get from them, you get a lot of grief from them, the Pacific Salmon Treaty, but they do focus on managing wild stocks. They really don't have that much in terms of enhancement up there, other than in the Prince William Sound pink salmon fishery for stocks. But in the sockeye and in other areas, they're managing wild stocks. Places in BC where we're managing wild stocks really well. I think the Nass is one. I think that on the Fraser, there's a lot of effort to manage the wild sockeye stocks and curtail fisheries when stocks are low. But it doesn't fix the ocean survival. But there are good examples where we have good assessments in season, tell us we've got a problem, cut back the fisheries, get the fish to the spawning grounds. It isn't all doom and gloom. There's places where that's being done well. But a big piece of what we're missing right now is monitoring escapements in a rigorous manner in all the key streams throughout the province. We've got a ton of beautiful, pristine habitat, wild populations that we don't have a clue what's going on in because we're not doing that work on an annual basis that we should be doing. And that's not each one of the 4,000, 5,000 streams that have salmon. That's just the core group of maybe 600 specific stream species combinations. That's the job, and we're not doing it. And we're not doing it for the reasons Brian has pointed out with the ocean stuff. There's not the commitment at the senior levels of government to have a core program to monitor these populations. And if we're doing a good job of monitoring, then we can make wise decisions. Yeah, we may not be able to fix the ocean tomorrow, but at least we'll keep the fish spawning and keep them, our managers having the information they need to manage.
Well, and that's why I think it's so important to use the money that's coming well, and then Finn, of course, has another initiative within the Fraser to do it. Small correction, though, in Alaska. I mean, they are heavily invested in enhancement, and under the treaty, they just got U.S. federal money to build 2 more hatcheries in Southeast. They're very heavily invested in pinks. Southeast Alaska is heavy pinks, Chinook, coho, and chum. They don't have sockeye, so they really don't. They rely on bycatch of Canadian fish on that. But so they're not off the hook. They're definitely there. On that, so. Thank you.
You'll need in retirement.